My name is Csaba Nikolényi. I'm a professor of political science here at Concordia. I'm also director of the Azrieli Institute. It's very difficult in these tragedy-filled days to use the word delight and please. And of course, I'm referring to the tragic days that Israel has been experiencing since October 7th. But I still would like to risk the word delight and pleased when I welcome to our distinguished speaker, because we really are so grateful that she agreed to come visit us from Brandeis University, even though it's the timing for any kind of research-related visit and talk is more challenging today than normally is. So with that introduction, I want to welcome Dr. Dalia Wassner, who is visiting us from Brandeis University, and who is director of the Jews of the Americas initiative down at the university. So please allow me to introduce briefly Dalia by sharing some of the highlights of her distinguished CV and her distinguished profile, and then I'm going to turn the microphone and the floor over to her so that she can tell us about from Curacao to Jerusalem, the Americas and the global Jewish diaspora. So Dalia, as I mentioned, is director of the Jews of the Americas, which is an initiative at Brandeis University, specifically at the university's Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies. Dalia is a historian, a research and teaching dedicated to providing more inclusive and interdisciplinary approaches to the Jewish diaspora and broadening the academic fields of Jewish studies, Latin American studies, and diaspora studies. She is author of the book titled Harbinger of Modernity, Marcos Aguinis and the Democratization of Latin America, published in 2014 by Brill. And this book illuminates the intersecting roles of Jews and public intellectuals in bringing democracy in a post-authoritarian, post-dictatorship Argentina. Dalia is also guest editor of the launching issue of the journal Latin American Jewish Studies. The issue was published in the spring of 2022. Her scholarship has been published in numerous academic journals, including Latin American Research Review, Iberian and Latin American Studies, Contemporary Jewry, and the Journal of Modern Jewish Studies. Dalia serves on the Latin American Jewish Studies Association Board of Directors, the Jewish Women's Archive Encyclopedia Editorial Board in the field of Latin America, and the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry Board of Directors. It's really a delight, even under these difficult circumstances, to welcome Dalia, who's not only a wonderful colleague, a wonderful person, but as you've heard, also a very accomplished academic. So Dalia, thank you for accepting the invitation, and please take us from Montreal through Curacao to Jerusalem. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Csaba. It's really a pleasure as well for me and an honor to be here with you at Concordia University with my new friend and colleague, Professor Csaba Nikolényi, and the Azrieli Institute for Israel Studies. As Professor Nikolényi mentioned, I am the director of this new initiative at Brandeis called the Jews of the Americas, and our goal is to grow awareness of the depth and the breadth of Latin American Jewry, the multiple ways that we're connected to the global Jewish diaspora, which includes Mizrahi, Sephardic, and Ashkenazi Jews, and also to explore the many connections that we share and to broaden our community's notion of global Jewry and also of what it means to be Jewries of the Americas. And as such, we also focus on highlighting the salience of Latin American Jews as communities with an important connection to Israel. Latin American Jews are known for their steadfast and meaningful ties to Israel, their high-level knowledge of Hebrew, their Zionist youth movements and cultural organizations, organized communal trips to Israel, at various life cycle moments, and widespread shared ideals of Aliyah. So when Csaba invited me to come visit the Azrieli Institute, I was eager to join you here for a visit. My own work is also centered on a mission that aims to expand what we think of when we think of Israel-diaspora relations. So With that said, my talk today is based on some of my current research, which is based on a memoir written by a member of one of the oldest Sephardic families of the Americas, whose parents immigrated as Sephardic Jews through the Iberian Peninsula to Amsterdam, and then to the Caribbean, on his father's side to Curacao, on his mother's side to St. Thomas, and the family ended up in Panama. And this particular individual was born in Panama, right to this family story, and ends up in Cuba, actually, for 30 years of his life, from over 30 years, from 1922 until 1960, actually. So the memoir is written in 1954, so when he had just been in Cuba for 32 years. So titled From Curacao to Jerusalem, the Americas and the Global Jewish Diaspora, we planned for this talk to accompany the film titled Cuba's Forgotten Jewels, which hopefully you had a chance to view in the last few days. I understand it was made available to all who registered. And so I decided to plan my talk as a focus on the Caribbean, as a waypoint, a point of contact and a point of entry into the Americas over the generations for Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, of course, as well, which is the topic of the film. And from the 17th century, we have Jews coming, like I noted, mostly as the Sephardic diaspora was expanding not only in the Mediterranean basin and also the Baltic countries, but also to the New World. We come to the 20th century, where you have a strong immigration of Sephardic Jews of later periods that had gone to Ottoman lands, Turkish Jews that came to Cuba. That was a big immigration, actually, in the early 1900s to Cuba, especially after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire collapses. And then, of course, we see it become a haven for Ashkenazi Jews during World War II and before, right, when the Nazis already were influencing not only the political situation in Germany, but of course, being threatening security along the continent. So as a historian, I am convinced that when we think of diaspora, and as such, that not just the migration of people, but the evolution of what we think of when we think of peoplehood and the identity of peoplehood, that is both the collective identity and obviously individual versions, right? That the reasons and the conditions under which people emigrate, where they come from, the realities they encounter, where they arrive, when they arrive, these all converge to create intricate new identities that are a necessary amalgam of the old and the new, where they come from and where they arrive, the past and the present. And when, as historians, we're lucky enough to witness this process in real time, when there's a crafting of narrative that reveals this identity, that reveals a certain purpose to that identity, and we're allowed to kind of bear witness to this trajectory as told by the people that we're living it, that is really a treasure. And so this is what happened when I found memoir-related observations by Jacob Brandon. So this is his family tree, Joshua Pisa family tree, which was gifted to Brandeis University by Anita Enriquez, one of these other members of these families that came also to the Caribbean. It's beautiful and it's enormous, and we have digitized it since too, so you can access it through the Brandeis Library website. So as I mentioned, the memoir that you saw in the first slide was written in Havana, Cuba, by Jacob Brandon, or Jack as everyone knew him, Jack Brandon, in 1954. And like I mentioned, he came from the Caribbean. His father from Curacao, his mother from St. Thomas. And these were the first Jews that also came to inhabit the mainlands. They supported immigration to the U.S. It's known that the Curacao Jewish community also fed cantors and rabbis and expertise and money to emerging new communities in the U.S. and also in, for example, Central America, like Panama, and also, I think, in Montreal. You can still feel that connection today. And I wanted to focus on a specific characteristic of these early American Jews. And by American, I like to use the Americas, or American to designate sort of a whole, let's say, hemisphere almost, rather than what the U.S. people of the U.S. call American. Okay. In history, there's different models of how Jews modernize, and often we focus on the Haskalah model, the model of enlightenment, the Western European model of, you've heard of Moses Mendelssohn's famous be a man on the street and a Jew at home, and this idea to gain access to rights because we're all citizens. These are very modern notions, and in Jewish studies, there's this new trend to kind of understand maritime studies, right? The world is connected through oceans, and there was this notion that emerged called Port Jew. What is it to be a Port Jew? And that was really something specific to Sephardic Jews who lived in Mediterranean countries. And one scholar, her name is Lois Dobin, she studied Jewries of Trieste, Italy, and this idea that they would gain access and support of their governments to be merchants, usually, and they would gain certain political rights de facto and economic freedom de facto because of the service that they provided to their host countries. And what is interesting is that there's scholarship that supports that Sephardic Jews that maintained overtly their Jewish identities would, in these kind of ethnic networks, sometimes traverse new Jews or secret Jews that were already in the Americas, and that the lines were sometimes fluid. It wasn't always, in history, there's a clear chapter that ends here, black and white, and it starts there. And sometimes those roads weren't exactly so clear cut, especially in the 15 and 1600s. But the idea of port Jewries, as does refer to Sephardic Jews that maintained their identity and they came to the Americas, really, I think, and I argue in this research, has a very long legacy of how these Jews of the Caribbean saw their role within the Americas for generations to come. And so that's what I wanted to share with you today. This is a picture of Jacob Brandon. There were other writings that I came across. You can see miscellaneous writing, verses. He was a bit of a poet as well, and a philosopher. He loved to write. And so I wanted to show you some of his work as it came into my hands by his family members. And what I wanted to show you is that this idea of a Port Jew identity, where Jews gained a measure of political rights, economic freedom, and in so doing brought prosperity to their societies more largely. And this was all done through encouraging trade that relied on ethnic networks. And so Jews as an ethnic network is really like the core fabric, right, of that society. So the Panamanian American, meaning U.S., Cuban author of the memoir that I uncovered, Jacob Brandon Maduro, was, like I said, a descendant of such a family. And I want to show you how he understood his role as that of a Port Jew, rather than that as a Western, let's say, European Jew, and how that plays out in a Cuba that has just become independent from Spain with the help of the U.S., and he is sent there for 30 years, and he's bringing B'nai B'rith and Hillel not only to Cuba, but also advocating for it to come to all of Latin America at a time when Jose Marti is this great Cuban statesman and leader and P.S. friend of the Jews, who in New York helped fund part of the revolution that led to the independence of Cuba from Spain, but at the cost, the independence of Cuba from Spain is called the Spanish-American War. And that's when Spain lost its last holding in the Americas, and also the Philippines. So Spain falls as a world empire, and the U.S., some argue, starts there to become more expansive. And so I wanted to show you, how does Jacob Brandon understand his role in Cuba after the independence from Spain, when the US is very involved, but it's pre-Castro, that I think is very, very aligned with this Port Jewry mentality. But you'll see that it's kind of anachronistic if you think of what's happening in the Americas at that time, when Cuba and other Latin American countries are trying to ward off the influence of the US and to warn that we didn't throw off one colonial power in order to take on another, let's say, neo-colonial power. And I think that what holds it all together is this Port Jewry mentality. So that's what I wanted to show you of why Jews are agents of modernity, why Jews are good for the government, that they're a part of it, especially if we rely on the connection between countries as being the most important thing. And the Jews as a broker of this kind of, let's say, cosmopolitan view, this view of a world that is connected in order to better democracy and access is a more positive world, especially after World War II. That seems to be a no-brainer, even if it's anachronistic within Latin American terms or Caribbean terms. So what I was struck by is the most important part of his memoir was that he presented his work as an asset to the modern world, and that it would be a world that is positively affected by these ethnic networks of trade and friendship that was the fabric of Port Jewry. And so before I get to some of that evidence, I wanted to fill in the blanks a little bit and tell you who was this Jacob Brandon Maduro, Brandon on his father's side, Maduro on his mother's side. So he was born in the Republic of Panama on August 4th, 1880. And this was still when it was part of Gran Colombia, actually. He was educated, though, in New York. So these Sephardic families are international families with family members in New York and Panama, in Amsterdam, still in Paris. And he traverses these networks and talks about it in his own memoirs, even before going to Cuba. He talks about his childhood memories in Panama. Shabbat dinners at his grandmother Maduro's house are a highlight, not really as a religious event, but as a family event. He talks about his studies in New York and about working with his uncle Isaac at the U.S. Office of the Family Business, the Brandon Brothers banking firm, which also helped broker plans that supported the Panama Canal being built. The memoir importantly chronicles not only the family business in New York and in Panama, but the great respect that his father, David Brandon, had within not only the Jewish community, but also the broader society in Panama. So that is David Brandon. He becomes, if someone at the door, I don't know if you want to indicate that they can come in or.
Yes.
I just right. So here you have, there was a stamp with his face on it. Obviously, I went to Panama last January to give a talk actually at the oldest Sephardic synagogue in Panama City, which was the community of the Brandon Maduros. This is his great grandson. His name is Grant Brandon, and he's at the fire station that David H. Brandon founded. So, and this is chronicled in the memoirs, and in every source that I've read about the founding of Panama and the Panamanian institutions, not only Jewish sources, is giving credit to David Brandon Maduro for founding the first firehouse. And then when there were tremendous fires in Panama early on, that he himself would be lugging the water and helping people on the street among the smoke. That picture of him is one that his grandson took. So it's kind of off center and a little bit blurry, but that's standing today in Panama. And then we went to the cemetery, and that is his gravesite. And you can see it says Brandon there. Okay, so this is Jack's father, and we learned that the father was also a banker in Panama, and that he was very civically minded. Like I said, he was so beloved in Panama that the diary and my oral interviews and other written sources that were drafted by the community all refer to David Brandon's funeral being the only time that the cathedral bells have rung for a non-Catholic in Panama. And not only that when he died, David Brandon was very close with Dr. Manuel Amador Guerrero, who became the first president of Panama, that Dr. Guerrero told the widow that he personally would take care of her, that he would look after her, not take care of her, but make sure that her well-being was taken care of. And so this kind of position that not only David Brandon had, but other Jews in Panama had, that were really part of the foundations of the country. And in fact, the Sephardic Jews were famously welcomed to join the high society country clubs, etc., which were not always extended to Jews that came later and from other places. But it was known that the Jews, these early Sephardic Jews that came from the Caribbean, really helped to establish the modern country of Panama. And so here we have a direct connection, right? Because David is Jack Brandon's father. Okay. And when I went to the synagogue, I uncovered a few of these documents. These are other family trees. This is a receipt of a Torah scroll. These are different family trees that show you the connection. They all point to the Caribbean. And what's interesting is that a big portion of the community in Panama also hailed from St. Thomas, which passed hands in the Caribbean from different powers, but including Britain. And so a large component of the community in Panama were native English speakers. So I now hold it, or they've donated to the Brandeis Library some of their early prayer books, which were in English, actually. Okay. So this is just to show you how connected the Americas were very early on, right? And how Jews, especially these early Sephardic Jews, were really instrumental in founding what was the beginning of modern Latin America, especially in around Central America, Venezuela, other parts. And what is interesting is that by visiting them, they had these treasures. Well, I'm a historian, so for me, these are treasures. And so I sat down with this new kind of museum committee that they were forming to help them think about how can they best display these within their community. And they have a beautiful synagogue so that they can also share this knowledge not only with the Jewish day schools and Jewish community, but also the larger community, so that it becomes part of the public memory. Okay. So back to the memoir. The memoir traces Jacob's marriage, so David and Judith's son, to Esther Steinberger of Pennsylvania, Bradford, Pennsylvania. They wanted a Sephardic rabbi from Curacao to marry them, but Esther Steinberger's family belonged to a Reform synagogue in Pennsylvania, and the Orthodox rabbi from New York wouldn't marry them, so they didn't have that. But they hoped for that. And after they got married, they returned. So Jack is living in New York. He returns to Panama when his father David dies and takes over the family business. And he reflects that he enjoys being near his family, but he feels kind of stifled in Panama. And so he moves to New York, joins again his uncle Isaac, and then starts to try to trade within the shmata business, as we say, the Ashkenazi world, the cloth and stockings and clothing. And eventually that takes him to Cuba by way of New York, then New Rochelle, and then Cuba, where they move in 1922, which is and then he stays there basically the rest of his life until 1960, like I said, and dies on the way basically after they are forced to leave Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. The family is relocating to New York and then also Mexico, actually. So then this family ends up moving to Mexico for many years. So Brandon then attends school in Mexico and worked very hard to get rid of his Cuban accent, I'm told. And so that's a little bit of the biography. And what is interesting is it's in the Havana years that the reader of the diary is most privy to Jack's sense of responsibility for the community of the community of Jews in the Americas, not thinking in terms of what country do I live in, but rather we are Jews of the Americas and how do we support whatever country we happen to be in. That is a picture of the application for passports in 1917 for a U.S. passport, and then here it is gained, which I thought was worth sharing. So he writes in his diary about Cuba and how Cuba received not only his family, but the Jews in general. And so I wanted to share some of the quotes. And by the way, the original diary has not been found. I received a family's holding of a photograph, and they're still looking for the original, although I do have the original miscellaneous writings. So that's why this binder actually is what was given.
As a gas heating technician, he says the city is moving too fast.
That's the family's only holding as far as we know. So if you hear otherwise, please tell me. So this is how Jack, when he comes to Havana, reflects on what it is to be a Jew in Cuba. Up to this time, there have been no visible signs of anti-Semitism in Havana. The number of Jewish residents was small. These were mostly of Sephardic origin, whose language was the old Marrano, which I will uncover what that means, similar to that which was spoken at the time of Cervantes, and which the Cubans seemed to enjoy hearing. And so here you see there's like this authenticity, right? The Marrano is how the Spaniards used to call the secret Jews, or the new Christians also, to accuse them of being secret Jews, which means really pig. But here it's a sign of authenticity to a Spanish land. Cervantes, of course, is a celebrated Spanish writer who we also think perhaps was of Jewish roots. And so this idea that the Cubans liked hearing the Ladino because it was not only similar, but there's this authenticity, and like your greatest writers were also our people, right? Okay. He then goes on to make some slightly disparaging comments about the Yiddish speakers and how that's not as let's say, welcome to the Cubans' ears, right? That's a dissonance because it's not so authentic. And so you have actually a few comments that let you see how Jack and his wife Esther and their children come to live among the American, meaning U.S. expats that move to Cuba after 1920. These were some of the first Jews actually that come to Cuba were U.S. Jews that want to take advantage of kind of this new era of prosperity that was brought in because basically the U.S. was treating Cuba mostly like a protectorate, and they saw opportunities in Cuba. And so you have reflected in this memoir these kind of reflections of the U.S. Jewish community, the Sephardic Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, but in every other source that I've read on Cuba, both primary sources, meaning like reflections in the first person of people that lived through it, and also historical sources, you have a very divided community, or let's say communities of Jews, the Sephardim, the Ashkenazi, and then the U.S. Jews. And they had their own synagogues and their own organization and their own priorities. And we learned that Ashkenazi Jews often came, if it was before World War II, say in the interwar period, they often came mostly men, and then would work hard to bring the rest of the family. The Sephardim, after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire collapses, the whole family needs to immigrate, and it's an emergency, and so the families come together. So the form of migration of Ashkenazim and the Sephardim also takes a different form based on what's happening where they're coming from at that time. And so what's interesting as a historian is when you're reading these reflections, he talks a lot about how he identifies as a Sephardic Jew, but he's really a U.S. via the U.S. It's not the Sephardim that are coming from Turkey, and it's not the Sephardim that are coming in the 20th century. He's a Sephardic Jew of the Americas, that his family has been there for centuries. Okay, so they lived in an apartment building called Edificio Alaska with other friends and family that also similar to them are Caribbean Jews, many of them from Panama or New York that then moved to Cuba. And we read about Jack kind of reluctantly joining these Jewish communities, but being willing to do so in a leadership position because, I quote, it was not in Jack's nature to reside permanently in the community without trying to make some personal personal contribution to its progress. He spoke of himself in the third person. Okay. So here are some pictures of Jack and these are his children that are born in Cuba. This one is later on in his life, but it's the same. So these are different pictures that I have gathered from different members of the family that have given me permission to show them. Okay. We also hear Jack's general impressions of the Cuban people. So not only was this good or bad for the Jews, meaning how is it to be as a Jew in Cuba, but also what are the Cuban people like? And so I have a few quotes. I didn't put all of them up. One is to begin with. So again, he writes in the third person. Jack has found the people of Cuba rich and poor alike to be liberal-minded and friendly towards those who make a reasonable effort to understand them and work with them harmoniously. So those that make a reasonable effort, so that the welcoming society, the implication is that it should make a reasonable effort. And if they welcome them harmoniously, then there will be good relations. And I think that also is, again, a mentality of, like I said, like this Port Jewish idea that we are a benefit to you if you're willing to welcome us, rather than he does have the quote about Cervantes and that they like to hear our language, but also there's a utility in what we're doing. And if you're willing to welcome us, we'll be good for your society. In terms of the island, Jack wrote, Cuba is a matchless land in many ways. It has magnanimous soil, a salubrious climate, is free of poisonous flora and dangerous fauna, something which cannot be said of many countries on earth. He also writes that after 30 years of living in the country, because of course he's writing this in 1954, he's grateful that in Cuba his family has been able to have a safe and enjoyable life, and he was able to raise his family with some social and cultural distinction, he writes. So these are reflections on what it means for his family to come to Cuba. And we see that he's happy, that he's prospering. This was Mom and Dad is written by Earl, which is the son of David and Judith Brandon. So I'll get to that quote in a second, but that I wanted to put that picture up because you see that they own a car, and this is in front of their home, and this is in 1935. So they had been in Cuba for just over a decade, and they're succeeding, right? So this is a success picture. They're happy, they're prospering. And we learn that he starts to take on leadership positions as the world begins to need it, especially in the 1930s, to bring Jewish refugees that are Ashkenazi, because those are the ones that need to come in the 1930s up until obviously the 40s. And he works with the Joint Distribution Committee. So the film that was made available to you was also reflecting how the Joint helped through other venues, not this one, to bring refugees from Belgium in that case, but this was from Germany. And he headed an effort to bring German Jews actually to Cuba in the late 1930s. They set up a new agency called the Joint Relief Committee actually to care also for these refugees when they come. Brandon serves as a director of this Joint Relief Committee since it was established in 1937 until the end of 1938. And he writes that he expected Jews in the U.S. to do their part, that he was bringing them to Cuba after 1924 was very difficult for immigration into the U.S. because of the quotas that they had for Jews and other people from certain parts of the world. The Jews tended to be the most usual, let's say, clients. So he would also write to the Jews in the U.S. to say that they also have a responsibility to help these refugees while they're in Cuba, because most of them have an intent to move to the U.S. eventually, and that we need to help our brethren. And he is remembered for his effort in helping these Jewish refugees coming from Europe during the 1930s, so before World War II. And he's awarded a Cuban award, the Caballero of Knight of the Order in 1940 by the President of Cuba. And he ends up heading the application then for the B'nai B'rith chapter of Havana, which he is willing to do, and he says this in his memoir, he's willing to apply for a B'nai B'rith chapter in Havana because it will be an international endeavor. It would provide a link with U.S. Jews, and he says the rest of the civilized world, which from the perspective of a historian like me is somewhat offensive to talk about certain parts of the world as civilized and certain not, but you can see where he identifies, right? And it would be affiliated with the Anti-Defamation League, whose fight against racial injustice he understood to be powerfully backed by Washington. And so he wants to bring B'nai B'rith to Cuba in order to strengthen Jewish identity among Cuban Jews or Jews who are in Cuba. And he sees the value of that specifically as it will be in concert with U.S. Jews and the Joint and the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. And so he sees all of that as part and parcel of why he's willing to work so hard to bring B'nai B'rith, and by the way, also Hillel, do you have Hillel here in Concordia? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, so this is established in 1948, which might sound familiar also to the establishment of the State of Israel. He's nominated unanimously to become the president of the B'nai B'rith Charter in Havana. It's named the Maimonides Lodge, and within a year counted on the support of 100 people, most of them actually Ashkenazi Jews, but some Sephardic, he says. And so you see him kind of traversing these lines a little bit of Ashkenazi and Sephardic world, where he's thinking of like a Pan-American perspective, not just a Cuban perspective. And what is interesting, and this is where I'll get into a little bit of his reasoning, which I found very interesting, is that in narrating his kind of trajectory and his involvement in Jewish life, he invokes these various different figures. One is José Martí, who was a Cuban statesman who very much fought for Cubans to be proud of their own unique heritage, their kind of combined ethnic lineage, that no one region or country of the world is superior than another, but this idea to be proud of what is naturally yours, to not be envious or to think that it's, we need to be educated like the Greeks in order to be educated, right? We have education that can be authentic to us. But he invokes José Martí to talk about why this is good for Cuba, to bring these inter-American alliances when José Martí really worked to separate Cuba from U.S. influence. Okay, so I'll bring that in now into the talk. He writes, I'll come back to that quote. He writes, although mankind is one genus in the order of nature, there exists in all native and inherited cultures an ethnic individualism which contributes in its own imagery, style, and rhythm to the symphony of the universe, right? We all have our instrument. We all have our place. We find the same quality of uniqueness in each snowflake, in the petals of each flower, in the lines of every human hand, in the unrepeated drapery of each sunset, actually very beautiful indeed, in every object that meets the human eye. But this means universal intelligence manifests into infinite versatility and pours its glory into receptive minds among the children of men. That is Jack's writing. If you've read Martí, it's very reminiscent. And in fact, I wanted to show the picture of this page because after these words are followed an excerpt of, he quotes Martí. Martí expressed his concept of freedom this, and it was this part that he pieced on, actually. And so he's putting his own words of how, every petal of the flower is unique and important. Every instrument of the symphony matters. And then he has Martí, who writes about the importance of Cubans being proud of their own individual identity. And what is interesting is that then he goes on to quote James Monroe, who is known for this kind of protectorate over it. He gave it was this like the seventh address to Congress that he made, I think in 1822, but it became known as the Monroe Doctrine after 1850, and it was this idea that as Spain and other colonial powers were leaving or losing their colonies, let's say in the Americas, that the U.S. wouldn't allow any more intrusions by the Europeans, and that we would protect our own. And it was this kind of thinking that Jose Marti was actually fighting against, this idea that we don't need the U.S. to protect us, that it's really just another colonial power. But he invokes both of them, along with the Anti-Defamation League and B'nai B'rith. Let me show you how he does that. Okay. Oh, here we go. I did provide some. So this is the Monroe Doctrine. Oh, so 1823, not 1822. But it really only became called the Monroe Doctrine in 1850, and really wasn't so known until the early 1900s. But these are some quotes that I have from this State of the Union address that became this doctrine. The occasion has been judged proper for asserting as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization. And the idea that the U.S. would make sure to guard against that, right? Matthew wanted to make sure that the U.S. didn't then take it upon themselves to be the policeman of all of the Americas, and as such, really the legitimate or powerful country in the hemisphere. So Jack is invited actually in 1949 to this inter-American conference where he's going to be the principal speaker, November 8, 1949, at the Delano Hotel in Miami, to promote interest in inter-American understanding. And it was held under the auspices of the Miami Beach Lodge of B'nai B'rith, and the invitation was delivered to Jack by Mr. Vulcan, who was the then president of the Defamation League of New York. So you can see how these, organizations are all intertwined. And at the meeting, Mayor Turk of Miami Beach reads excerpts of Jack's own writings. So it's known that he's, himself a thinker. And the address was then reported favorably, not only in the local press, but also Jack is awarded the Freedom of the City Key along with this award, along with the Consul General of Cuba in Miami, whose name was Mr. Velasquez. This Consul General then travels to visit Jack in Cuba. They meet and files Jack's speech at this conference where he receives the award by B'nai B'rith. They filed the acceptance speech of Jack Brandon at the State Department, Ministro de Estado, the State Department in Havana, along with a report of the meeting. And Jack is very proud of that. He reflects that also in his memoir. And so he's putting together this narrative of this award that was given to him was valued by Cuba, right? As well. And he gets an award, and the Consul General of Cuba gets an award at the same time. And in this speech, Jacob explicitly lauds Jose Marti, and he does so alongside James Monroe, and mentions the Anti-Defamation League, which invited him, and B'nai B'rith, which is honoring him. And he presents them as complementary philosophical or political entities aligned in strengthening inter-American alliances as necessary at the time of Cuba's independence, as half a century later, when the free countries of the West all faced a call to band together against the despotism, of the East. So this is after World War II, of course. And so as we wrap up, I wanted to make sure, and I am actually right on time, I wanted to then talk about, if you notice, these dates aligns, of course. This is some of the press that we got. with the establishment of the state of Israel, right? And as he's raising funds for the B'nai B'rith Lodge, he is also reflecting a little bit frustrated, actually, in 1947, 1948, that he's competing for funds for this kind of inter-American society in which he would bring B'nai B'rith not only to Cuba, but to all of Latin America. That was the idea, that there were other competing interests, mainly to support the establishment of the state of Israel. And actually, just one quote, sorry. The other thing that Jack talks about is that just like UNESCO at the time was seeing in Havana as a new site for its own work, so too should Havana be a site not just for B'nai B'rith, but also for Hillel, as a place that would bring together kind of this civilized world, this idea of forces of democracy and of progress. So the Jewish organizations were aligning with other international organizations. There was also a Finlay Institute. Finlay helped a doctor that helped eradicate yellow fever and allowed for the building actually of the Panama Canal because of it. Because the workers weren't dying anymore, but changed the whole face of what it meant to health-wise. And so you had these institutes being founded in Cuba. They were all about international, inter-American cooperation. And it's in that context that he wants to bring B'nai B'rith and Hillel. And he writes, I'll just quote this very quickly, "We proudly behold the increasing stature of B'nai B'rith in our own day as a competently trained field unit wherever danger threatens the social stability of any communities in the Americas." So that sounds very much like Monroe. With these facts before us, we cherish the hope that this convention in a foreign but hospitable land, so he doesn't mind calling Cuba a foreign land, even after being there for 30 years, because it's hospitable, will serve as a precedent for other conventions overseas. So again, these are communities of connection connected across the seas, that it may prove to be the first span in a series of spiritual bridges across the waters, which physically separate the peoples of the Americas, that one day, not too far away, we shall visualize the completion of the remaining spans of this structure, B'nai B'rith, not made with hands, and dedicated as a memorial to the ageless longing for brotherhood in every human heart, reinforced by equality of opportunity for each, and every loyal citizen, whatever his race, color, or religious creed may be. That's a direct quote from his acceptance speech in 1949 to promote B'nai B'rith as an arm in the world of Jewish pride and solidarity that aligned with important work of UNESCO, and they gave an external measure of Cuba as a ready partner for a larger regional network that would be aligned across the Americas for the benefit of mankind. Okay, so I wanted to finish with that, and then just very quickly, if I can have 3 more minutes, just talk about this idea of what Israel meant to Jack Brandon, because he does dedicate a chapter to the establishment of the state of Israel, reflected in 1954, so just over 5 years after its founding, with pride. He says, the subject is prominent in all times in his thoughts. Again, he writes in the third person. So the subject of Israel is prominent at all times in his thoughts. And he describes Israel like he describes the U.S., an honorable partner to peace with its neighbors, arguing in this vein that Jewish communities in the diaspora are proud and supportive of Israel, and that this very pride reflects well on them too. He writes, and that's up here, at this point, Jews the world over need not suffer the pangs of religious self-consciousness and social frustration. And then he writes, the new virile community, heir in great part to 2,000 years of dispersion and tragedy, reminds us of the extraordinary fact that the Jews as an ethnic group have never surrendered or outlived their sense of responsibility. And so there's a chapter that's dedicated, once his B'nai B'rith is successful and Israel is successful and they're not competing for funds, there's this reflection of what Israel means to him as a Jew in Cuba in 1954. This is before the Cuban Revolution. The Jews are doing very well in Cuba at this time. This is the heyday of America's success and American success in Cuba. And so I wanted to end with that reflection. Those are pictures that are not in that. Those are the only pictures that are not related to Jack. But the memoir, they're not in his memoir, but the text is. And so I wanted them to accompany that. And I think that with that, I'm happy to conclude, take some questions from the audience. And we can also talk about, of course, Cuba's forgotten jewels. Any questions you might have in general. So thank you so much for.
Thank you very much. Oh, yeah, thank you. So this event is hybrid. So we do have friends here in the seminar room joining us, and we have friends, many friends joining us from different parts of the world. So let me perhaps ask those who are present here in Montreal to see if they have any comments, questions, and yeah, please.
2 comments and 1 question. The mother of Cantor in Zeltmeyer, George Schleich, grew up in Curacao.
Yes, I've learned that recently.
Yeah, that's why we were laughing.
Yes.
I have a friend who actually teaches here at Concordia. She grew up in Cuba. Part of her family was Jewish and part of it was Chinese. Her brother ended up moving to Israel. Her parents were divorced, and her mother was about here time between Miami and Toronto. So my friend ended up moving to Canada, got her PhD here. My question is, the Turkish Jews were obviously so close to Palestine. Why did they come to the Caribbean?
So it was easier, I think, for them to come to the Caribbean than to go to Palestine. It wasn't, their immigration to Palestine wasn't so welcome, I think, at the time. And I think that it was easier for them to get the permission. It was known that with buying a passage to Cuba and perhaps a little bribe to the person that would meet you there, you were basically all set. And there was a growing Sephardic community in Cuba that was known. And so you have actually like these systems of family, like a chain migration also, and families came together. So I think that it was, and Cuba, in fact, in the 1920s, saw enormous migration, not only of Jews, also and through 1950 of Spaniards, Chinese. So I wonder if your friend's ancestry involved an immigration to Cuba from China as well. But it was an island that was a huge destination for immigration for people that wanted to come to the Americas, and for Jews that wanted to come to America, meaning the U.S., in 1924, when that was closed, because a lot of, especially Ashkenazi Jews, wanted to come to the U.S., there was, for a time, a loophole that if you spent a year in a Latin American country, you could then apply. And then they closed that along with the quotas in 1924. And so there were Jews that were, and then there was an expression, hacer la América, make the American Cuba, that they stayed in Cuba to hacer la América, to make it their America. But Sephardic community is really, especially from Turkey, migrated entire groups to Cuba because it was very welcoming at that time. Yes.
Could you tell me what did Jack study in New York?
I believe he studied economics. I know that actually he also, a part that I didn't talk about, which is not your question, but the other thing that he spent time doing was going to these spirituality lectures in New York. So if you've heard of Franz Boas or Felix Adler, these Jews, a lot of them were actually German Jews that were exploring kind of the spiritualist movements that were not Jewish, but they were kind of like universalist. And he spent a lot of time in Carnegie Hall where they would have their meetings, listening to their lectures, and reflected in writings to his father that he found that more fulfilling than going to the Sephardic synagogue with his uncle Isaac. But I'm pretty sure he studied economics, but that's a great question. And he started for a time at the bank, the Brandon Brothers Bank in New York, but he was quite miserable. It sounds like it wasn't for him. So he then merged and veered off to start a trade business. And that's what took him back from Panama to Paris and to Amsterdam, to Cuba for the first time, which is when he realized there was a market in Cuba, actually, and other Americans that were moving there. So I answered your question and then others that came to mind.
Perfect answer.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, so I'm curious, did I hear correctly? You made reference to the forgotten jewels.
Yes.
What is meant by that?
Okay, so there's a movie that is called Cuba's Forgotten Jewels that was made by two filmmakers. One is Judy Craith, who is the daughter of Marian Craith, who's featured in the film, and Robin Trinsdale, and they used JDC archives and interviews with refugees from Belgium, from Antwerp actually. They came to Cuba during the late 1930s when they had a moment that they were allowed in, and they reflect actually that famous SS that St. Louis that was turned away, and how devastating that was. But they were allowed entry. There was this group of refugees that the government for a time allowed entry to Cuba, and they found in Cuba refuge. And thanks to a law that was passed that they did allow, for a time you couldn't gain employment in Cuba if you weren't a born Cuban citizen. And so Jews would work as peddlers and as, like these types of makeshift sweatshops because they couldn't be officially employed. But then there was a new rule that if you had a business that employed half of the employees would be Cuban, the other half could be foreign born. And so there was a diamond industry that emerged just in these years in Cuba, and that whatever you were before, you became a diamond cutter, basically, because that gave you a livelihood, and that the diamonds would come from Africa to New York to Cuba. They would be cut in Cuba, and then they would be sent back to New York. And the owner of one of the major factory in 1946 got entry to the US, and that was the end of that trade. And so this film traces the story of Jews that came from Belgium to Cuba, sometimes only stayed for, say, 5-6 years. And especially for the younger people, for the teenagers that came, what did it mean to them to come from Europe to Cuba, for it to be a whole other culture, climate, lifestyle, especially on, language, and also with the knowledge of the family that didn't escape, of what was happening in Europe, and the desperation actually as well. So that's all reflected in the film. And this film debuted, I think, in 2018. The National Center for Jewish Film supported the film. They're based in Boston, actually, as well. And so when it debuted in Boston, I did the opening and interviewed both Judy and Robin, the filmmakers, to a sold-out group. And there were members of the audience that were Cuban Jews that didn't even know about the story, because it was a moment in time. It was just a few years. And as you saw, the different communities of Jews in Cuba were sometimes quite separate, even the Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and the US Jews. So not everyone would have known about the existence. And in fact, when I talked to Judy about the research of Jacob Brandon and his help with German refugees, their network didn't know about that because, again, these were different nodes of operation. Yes.
Do we have any comments, questions in the chat from the online audience? Yes.
We have from Yitzhak Kerem. In 1941, was he active in the St. Louis refugee boat effort and protest?
Was he active? Not that I know of, but he was active in the years before he started this relief committee between 1937 and 1938, and then he abandoned his post then, but it does continue. But he worked for about 3 years to help bring German refugees, even before actually the onset of World War II, but obviously the onset of Nazism, right? And Kristallnacht and all this.
One more, this is it. Yeah? Just very briefly, I made I find it fascinating that the only reflection about Israel comes 6 years after Hakamat Medina.
Yeah.
And indicating, almost suggesting that he really wasn't a Zionist, was he? I mean, there's no mention of the Zionist movement, it seems, ever
Yes.
before. Is that true? That this is the only time we see
So
it?
in my reading of his writings, when it first emerges as a topic, and it has to do with, it's at the same time that he's building B'nai B'rith in Cuba, and is very focused on, he writes about going to New York and reading with Mr. Munsky, who directed also Hillel, and Dr. Abraham Shahar, who becomes, who was his co-director of Hillel at first, and then becomes the first president of Brandeis, actually. And he goes to speak with them, and he tells them that there's, 1 million Jews south of the U.S., between the Caribbean and the rest. At this time, in the 1940s, I think, the figures I have are about 4.5 million Jews in the U.S. at the time. So if you have another 1 million, it's a substantial number. And that he's writing about the importance that it is that we support our Jewish brethren in the Americas, that they be Jewish before they're Cuban, that they not lose this, that they not assimilate. Because one thing that you'll read about a lot in Cuba and other places is the Jews did assimilate into the larger cultures. And so it was important to him that they know that they were Jewish first. So he was very focused on supporting the Jews of the Americas, to know what it means to be Jewish. And it wasn't in terms of Israel. And Israel was competing at the same time for funding. But then he realizes what Israel, I think that he evolves his understanding of what Israel means to the Jewish diaspora. This is before it was Israel in the diaspora, it was just the Jewish diaspora. And now suddenly we have Israel again. And so it evolves, and he dedicates a chapter to it in his memoir. And it's in that context. So it's very interesting. But it's not about Zionism. It's about Israel is more proof about how Jews are a form of progress and modernity and humanity, in the region, as are Jews in the Americas. Hence our partnership with UNESCO and all this.
Fascinating. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So let me take one final look around in the room and online anymore. If there are no other questions, comments, and of course, the audience is always welcome to, even after the event, to share any reflections with us by email, which we're always delighted to relay to our speakers.
Yeah, and I'll be happy to answer after that.
I would like to thank you on everybody's behalf, in the room and online, Dalia, for accepting our invitation and coming up from Brandeis to spend this day, this afternoon, this couple of days with us here in Montreal, and sharing this research that I certainly was not aware of. I'm sure there are many others benefited from this illumination. And we look forward to being in touch, thinking about various ways in which we can collaborate. Israel studies, Jews of the Americas, and clearly there are many opportunities for intersection. So thank you for making that first step in that direction. And we wish you much success in your continued scholarly endeavors. And we look forward to this being just the beginning of many future opportunities for our interactions. So thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to the very same. Thank you.
Thank you.